There was never a eureka, we found it kind of moment. It was kind of a slow realization. Okay, this looks completely different than we expected, but this is the ship. Later, we looked at the location for the paddle wheels, and what we discovered was a depression in the bottom that matched the exact size of the paddle wheels. And that was, again, one of the moments like, okay, this is our ship. In terms of the ship itself, it is an incredible state of preservation. We are saving the exact description and what's there for later release, but I'll say that the state of preservation is excellent. We expect to find items made of leather, items made of clothing, items made of wool perhaps, bottles of wine with the corks still in them. It is beyond anyone's imagination of what's actually there. It's all there.
I'm Peter McCulley. Almost 150 years ago, the SS Pacific left British Columbia on its way to San Francisco and sank off the coast of Washington state with only 2 survivors aboard and a cargo that could contain as much as 200 pounds of gold. We'll talk with Jeff Hummel, who leads the salvage efforts, when Today in BC continues.
Why spend hours searching dealerships, comparing makes and models? Find the best of BC's inventory in one place, todaysdrive.com. You'll have access to inventory across BC, where you can easily find a vehicle that fits your needs and gets you where you need to go in comfort. Get in the driver's seat. Don't miss out on the many options we have available for you. Powered by Black Press Media, todaysdrive.com connects you with exclusive new and used car deals.
Thanks for chatting with us today, Jeff.
Great to be with you.
Jeff, you're the captain of the Sea Blazer and president of Rockfish Incorporated, which has been granted exclusive salvage rights for the shipwreck of the SS Pacific. So before we talk about how you actually found the wreck and what you hope to find, tell us about the SS Pacific, the ship itself. It had a long history.
Yeah, the SS Pacific was a sidewheel steamer. It was built in 1850 for the California Gold Rush. It worked on the East Coast a little bit and then was brought out to the West Coast. 25 years after the California Gold Rush, it was brought into service in the Northwest. It was engaged in the first regularly scheduled runs from Seattle and Victoria to San Francisco. And so it was an important vessel in the development of trade of the Northwest. On November 4th, 1875, it departed Victoria Harbor around 9:30 in the morning. And about 12 hours later, it was on the bottom. It had collided with a ship called the Orpheus, and it sank in the first few hours of what some people would call a 100-year storm. So it was a double hit. It sank due to a collision. The survivors were clinging to the wreckage to save their lives in this massive storm.
In those days, there would have been 2 or 3 different levels of passengers, correct?
Yeah, on the SS Pacific, good old Nelson and Perkins, the ones who were operating the vessel, were famous for clobbering their competition with rate wars. And so there were 2 classes of passengers on board the vessel. There was first class, and then there was steerage. And the ride on the vessel varied depending on where your cabin was. And so the steerage passengers were in the stern and all the way up in the bow of the ship in the kind of the least comfortable places. The first class passengers were primarily on the main deck.
And how many hands would have been aboard?
The ship had a crew of about 50 people. The contemporary accounts basically indicate there was a total of about 325 people on board, but I think that estimate is really low. There's someone who was in the territorial legislature in British Columbia, a guy named David Higgins. About 25 years after the ship went down, he wrote an account about the ship sinking, and he was at the dock the morning that the ship departed. And his estimate is that there were more like about 500 people on board. So we'll never really know. The contemporary accounts basically say 325, but based on the reputation of the owner of the ship and what they were trying to do in this rate war, even in the advertisements for the ship for that day, mention discounted rates. And so I think there were a lot more people on board than 325 people.
Jeff, I understand from newspaper reports, the ship's log reports there was a rowdy group of miners who were returning from the goldfields in northern British Columbia on board. Is that where the reports as much as 200 pounds of gold on board come from?
Yeah, the newspaper accounts talk about the miners, but in today's times, people often say we should return to the gold standard. The problem with the gold standard is you have to move gold around. Gold is heavy, it's awkward to transport, it can't be done electronically, you have to physically move it. So the commerce of British Columbia then was dominated by 2 major gold rushes. One in the Caribou District and one in the Cassiar District, which is further north and had been recently discovered in about 1872. The merchants in Victoria would collect up gold from the miners and other merchants. It would go to the banks. Sometimes it would be assayed. And then eventually that gold had to be shipped to San Francisco to pay the bills. So if there's gold on board the ship, that's where it comes from. Some of the individual miners may have gold.
And you mentioned the Orpheus, the other ship which was involved in the collision. It was bound for Nanaimo. What became of the Orpheus after the collision?
The Orpheus was really not having very good luck. First of all, they caused the collision with the Pacific. The next day, they sailed around in this massive storm, repairing their rigging. And then the next night, they decided that they were ready to go into the Straits of Juan de Fuca. And when they saw the light on the coast, they saw a revolving light. There wasn't a revolving light on their chart, but they thought maybe something had changed, and they headed in anyway. Turned out they were headed into Barkley Sound and not into the Straits of Juan de Fuca. The ship wrecked on Zartas Island in Barkley Sound, and my understanding is a popular dive site today, and people do recreational diving on it. So it sank pretty much in the same event and is still out there.
And you mentioned this was a once in a 100-year storm, which I guess would spread that wreckage over a very large area. How did you actually find it?
As you mentioned, the wreck was spread over a huge area. Some of the wreckage was found over 150 miles away from the wreck, as far in as Bellingham Bay. We found the wreck through two different methods. One, we did as much historical research as we could possible on the ship to determine the course that they sailed, the speed of the ship. We did a great deal of analysis of all of its previous runs and were able to come up with the whole speed of the ship based on their normal cruising. We did a lot of research to find the actual tidal currents for the day of the sinking. So the second longest continuous tidal record in the world is for Astoria, Oregon. And from that, we're able to calculate the tidal currents for the Straits of Juan de Fuca, which was really important for determining the course of the ship. The two survivors were also key to that analysis. One of the survivors was a railroad surveyor, and he had just completed the survey of the Canadian Pacific Railroad. And so his observations are very accurate when he talks about directions and headings and this sort of thing. Neil Henley, the other survivor, was at the helm the watch before the ship sank. And so his information and speed and direction was paramount. But what we discovered, and ultimately, is the ship sank in very unusual circumstances. There was a very strong current from the north in part of the journey, and there was a very strong current from the south in part of the journey. And that resulted in the ship ending up where it landed on the bottom. So we did all this analysis. We used side-scan sonar, which is a device that creates an aerial image of the bottom. And we weren't really having that much luck. And so one of the things that I did is I interviewed a commercial fisherman who worked in the area to see what they had brought up in their nets. And eventually I found one commercial fisherman who had brought up some coal in his nets. And by strange circumstance, he had actually saved a piece of it. So I acquired the piece of coal and had it chemically analyzed by a laboratory in Alberta. And they worked with a geologist on Vancouver Island in hopes that I would find that the coal had come from a particular mine on Vancouver Island. Well, that turned out not to be the case. And the coal actually came from Coos Bay, Oregon. And then again, once returning back to the archives, doing more research, I was able to find that the owners of the ship, Goodall, Nelson, and Perkins, owned one of the largest coal mines in Coos Bay. It was called the Libby Mine. And then I was able to find some World War II mining records that actually had the same chemical analysis of that mine. And they weren't a perfect match, but they were very close. And so I assumed it came from the Libby mine, or maybe they bought some coal from an adjacent mine. So I was able to determine the coal was from the Pacific, because the only explanation was that the coal was loaded on the San Francisco end of the journey. So then the question became, where did the coal come from? And the commercial fisherman I worked with was on a ship that he did not own. I was able to get the logbook eventually from the ship. And in there were the coordinates where he'd lost his net. So what happened is he lost the net on the bottom, later went back with grappling hooks. And when he pulled the net up, there was a bunch of coal in it, like a wheelbarrow load of coal. And so he thought it was so strange, he had saved that. Using the logbook and where they started and where they ended up, it was about a 20-mile run. The initial conclusion was Occam's razor. The simplest answer is usually the right one. And that the coal had come from where he had lost the net. And so we spent 2 seasons examining that area. And it's a very convoluted, strange area on the bottom. There's all these canyons and hanging canyons, very difficult area to search, and an easy place to hide a shipwreck. It turned out it wasn't there. So we slowly worked our way back down his track, eventually getting to the origin. And then around that time, we found a second fisherman who'd also brought up coal, and he had a lot better idea where it had come from. So based on that, we used sonar equipment that we built, and we examined this very small area and discovered the wreck.
So how long have you been interested in searching for the wreck of the Pacific, and when did it all begin?
For me, it really began in high school. A friend of mine from high school, when we were in college, had purchased this very thorough accounting of Northwest maritime history, and in there it mentioned the Pacific. And it seemed like an interesting shipwreck to go after. It seemed pretty challenging based on where it resided. That was the spark that started my whole journey on this project.
How did you do research on the SS Pacific? As you mentioned, you were in high school when you were first interested in this.
This all started before the internet, and so the only way that you could do research was to travel around and go to these various archives. So I spent a lot of time in Victoria, in the various archives there, looking through newspaper accounts, particularly from Victoria Colonist was the newspaper at the time, and then understanding that there was telegraphic transmission of stories at the time. So there was a telegraph line that ran down to San Francisco. So there was a good source of archival information there. I owned a medical supply company at the time, and I was in sales. And so I was traveling around, and I would just tack on a few extra days in various places and do archival research. And so I was able to do it in New York, Washington, D.C., Victoria, San Francisco, and visit all the archives and rummage through the microfilm. And it was a lot of work.
Since it's pretty deep water, as you mentioned, you're using remote control vehicles to search the area and find the wreck itself. And I understand some of this technology you designed and built yourself.
That's correct. Underwater robotics are notoriously expensive devices. We always say in order to have one, you have to have two. So we couldn't afford two robots or the capabilities that we needed. I'd previously worked in the underwater robotics industry, and we designed and built our own robots for this particular project. Saved a great deal of money and gave us a lot of capability.
When Today in BC continues, Jeff Hummel talks about the history of the team, salvage rights and claims for private belongings of ancestors of those lost in the shipwreck of the SS Pacific.
Hey, it's the Moj, Bob Marjanovic. Join me on the Moj on Sports podcast on Black Press Media at todayinbc.com. Listen into conversations with well-known athletes and celebrities as we look behind the scenes at these successful people. Listen in to the Moj on Sports podcast on todayinbc.com. You'll also find the Moj on Sports podcast on iTunes, Spotify, Amazon, iHeart, YouTube, and Google Podcasts, as well as mojonsports.com.
I'm Peter McCulley. Today in BC is a Black Press Media podcast. Jeff, tell us about the moment when you realized that you had actually found the shipwreck when you were, I take it, looking at sonar.
It's an interesting question. Among our group, we had decided on a code word to send out via text message or email, and the code word was fire truck. And it took me a long time to send that message because I wasn't really certain when we found the wreck if it was really our wreck. It looks completely different than anyone would expect. When we originally discovered the image of the wreck, I was sitting at the side scan, happened to be on my watch. And I looked at it and I said, okay, that's the ship. There's the steam engine, there's the wreck. And then the crew got all excited and everything. And I'm like, okay, I got to calm these guys down a little bit because this might not be the wreck. But what if it's not? So we did a second pass on it. And on the second pass, it really didn't look like anything. It just looked like geology. There was nothing distinguishing about it at all. So using good search theory practices, we continued on with our search to eliminate the whole area to see if there was any potential better targets. And it wasn't until the next season that we're actually able to go back and look at this particular location. So when we did that, we imaged it at higher resolution. And in the sonar data, we could see something that appeared to be the paddle wheels. And we know from the historic accounts that the paddle wheels fell out at the surface. And so if this was the wreck, the paddle wheels had to be in the vicinity. It turns out they're actually several hundred meters away from the main wreck area. And so we had the correct orientation. Everything was lying on the bottom where it should be and pointed the right direction. But still, there was a lot of doubt about, is this really the wreck? And after spending about a day or two side scanning the target at high resolution, I was able to determine the spacing on some of the timbers that we saw in the sonar picture. And that turned out to be 0.9 meters, which is 36 inches. And that was exactly the framing spacing on the Pacific, which I had from my research. So I'm like, okay, now It's possible, I guess, that every other shipwreck from that era had the same spacing. I don't know that, but I did know that it matched the Pacific. And that was the moment that I'm like, okay, this is the wreck. There was never a eureka, we found it kind of moment. It was a slow realization. Okay, this looks completely different than we expected, but this is the ship. Later, we looked at the location for the paddle wheels, and what we discovered was a depression in the bottom that matched the exact size of the paddle wheels. And right in the center of that depression is an iron shaft, 16 inches in diameter and about 2.5 feet tall, sticking right out of the bottom. And it had actually caught some fishermen nets at one point, and so we knew it was a very sturdy item. It weighs about 40,000 pounds, and so it's securely embedded in the bottom. And that was, again, one of the moments like, okay, this is our ship.
And what kind of shape is the wreck in?
In terms of the ship itself, it is an incredible state of preservation. We are saving the exact description and what's there for later release, but I'll say that the state of preservation is excellent. We expect to find items made of leather, items made of clothing, items made of wool, perhaps, bottles of wine with the corks still in them. It is beyond anyone's imagination of what's actually there. It's all there.
And how long a period of time are you talking about for you and your team to explore the debris field and the SS Pacific itself?
We have a 3-year plan in place to examine the wreck. So the first year, we're going to go after the debris field. And that's mostly because it's in jeopardy of being damaged further by commercial fishermen. They drag their nets through the area. They have trawl doors that weigh about a ton each. So we're going to do that area first. We have a 45-day expedition planned for this summer. We have a total of 12 ROV operators that will be working on that from land. So we'll have the equipment on board the vessel and underwater, but the operators will actually be in a control van here in Seattle. And we're using telepresence to operate the robotics. The second season and third season, we plan on spending about 8,000 hours of ROV time on the main wreck the first season, probably about 6,000 hours the second season. And then there will be a fourth season, which will basically be to recover the large items. So we're going to recover one of the paddle wheels, hopefully one of the boilers, and all of the steam machinery. Some pretty heavy lifting going on. The steam engine itself weighs 50,000 pounds.
So you've been searching for the SS Pacific, as you say, for a long time, and you've made now about a dozen offshore expeditions to survey the area. How have you financed the trips, the development of the equipment that you built, and all the rest of it?
We have a group of 45 subscribers who've put some money into the project. We have a business plan that says that if we do the right things, that we can make a profit. So far, we've spent $2.1 million getting to this point, and we expect to spend $6 to $8 million to finish the project.
How long is the season? You mentioned that you'd be down there for 3 to 4 seasons. How long is a season for you?
It really depends on the year, but the weather in the area can be a problem. The vessel that we purchased to do the operation had operated out there, and I think back in the old climate, it was fine. But nowadays, with the sort of climate changes, we're seeing that the weather window gets less and less. But we will have the right equipment to stay out there, again, 45 days this year and approximately 60 to 90 days in the subsequent years.
Jeff, could you explain for me the laws to regulate shipwrecked findings and salvage goods?
The laws regarding shipwrecks, the first part is, where did you find it? So is it in Canadian waters? Is it in U.S. waters? Is it in international waters? And in the case of the Pacific, it is in international waters. So by treaty, almost every maritime country in the world agrees to a set of standardized salvage laws. The laws are designed to return the cargo back to commerce. And so they're based on traditional salvage, like a ship sinks and it's got some cargo on board, you want to recover it. In our case, we had to recover an item from the wreck to bring it into federal court so that the court could have jurisdiction over the wreck because it is in international waters. So we did that, and we have been granted exclusive salvage rights. Now, that doesn't mean that we own everything on board the vessel. It's almost a process like probate. So if some of the cargo was insured or there's personal belongings, those people potentially have rights in those items. We end up with the lion's share, but there's a process that you go through to determine who owns the things that are on the wreck. We are the exclusive salvers, which means we're the only ones who can recover those items.
So let's talk about private belongings for a second, Jeff. On board the SS Pacific, I understand claimants may be entitled to their goods provided they have proof of ownership and make a claim within an allotted period of time.
So that is what the law says. And if claimants can prove that they are an heir, And an heir doesn't mean just you're a descendant. You have to be the right descendant. And so if you are an heir, and you have to actually prove it, which means you have to go through all the probate files from all of your relatives that have deceased. You have to have birth certificates. You have a lot of documentation to actually prove that. So if you are an heir and we do find something on board the vessel, then you may have some rights to it. I think in practical terms, that's not going to happen. There are other parties to the salvage, and those are the underwriters and the insured. So the people who insured the ship still have rights in it, and we are currently in negotiation with the underwriters of the cargo and of the ship.
So, Jeff, you've been out about a dozen times now, and having spent some time on boats myself, I'm pretty sure you probably have a mascot aboard for good luck.
Our mascot is actually on the shipwreck. And my granddaughter has named her Lily, and I call her Lily the mischievous octopus. So on Expedition 11, we had spent 9 days out in the area imaging the entire wreck site, just trying to understand everything. We had a few hours left. We're on the main portion of the wreck, and we came across an octopus, a female octopus that had burrowed into a part of the wreck. And so we stopped the ROV, and we just all sat there in awe looking at this beautiful creature that we had no expectation to find whatsoever. And then nearby, Lily has a friend, and we've named him Stan, and he is a sunstar starfish. He's about a foot in diameter, friendly-looking character. And so the ROV moves on, and when we're out on these expeditions, we learn about 30% of what we're going to learn when we're on the expedition, and about 60% of it when we're back at the office looking through the data. So when we're looking through the data, we noticed that Lily, in her collection of shells that she had arrayed in front of her den, there was a great big copper spike. And we're looking for something to bring to federal court. And I'm like, there it is. Lily's got it. Let's go back and get it from Lily. So we went back on Expedition 12. About half the crew were new people, hadn't been out in recent times, so they didn't know about Lily. And I swore the other part of the crew to silence, expecting that we'd have this great aha moment. I drive the robot right to Lily's den, and she had moved out and taken all of her possessions, including the copper spike. I'm like, what? That can't happen. But she had taken her large shells that she had collected and this big copper spike, and she had moved on to some other spot. And she thought that she had been visited by some sort of alien life force. When this big robot shows up with lights and everything on, of course she's going to think she's been visited by aliens and it's time to leave. But it was a big surprise, and so we call her Lily the mischievous octopus, and we're hoping to find where her new den is.
Jeff, you mentioned your high school friend, Matthew McCauley. Your company, Rockfish, is associated with the Northwest Shipwreck Alliance, which you started in partnership with Matthew. You went to high school together. You two discovered a Navy plane in Lake Washington when you were fairly young, I think 18 or 19, a Curtiss Helldiver, which is currently under restoration in Colorado. And oh yeah, you were sued by the U.S. Navy. That sounds like a great story.
Getting back to the origins of the Pacific story, and it was something that my father had told me about. He was working at the Boeing Renton plant and actually witnessed an airplane sink right out in front of him while he was eating his lunch. And that led to me wanting to salvage World War II planes from the lake if there were any others. When I was in high school, Matt acquired a side scan sonar, which is the tool you need to find anything out in a vast area. And we imaged some airplanes that were on the bottom. And when we dove down, we discovered all of them didn't have engines. So we knew that they had been abandoned. We wrote a letter to the Pentagon, said, hey, we found these airplanes that you dumped in the lake. And they're like, oh, wait a minute. We didn't dump anything in the lake. No, not us. So we thought, okay, great. If you didn't dump it, then we'll just go get it. So we went and salvaged it. And then all of a sudden, the Navy's like, well, wait a minute. That still belongs to us. And we're like, you wrote a letter and said you didn't know anything about it. We're like, that doesn't matter. Letter means nothing. Okay, great. We got sued by the federal government, United States versus Hummel et al. It was an eye-opening experience at a young age to be sued by the federal government. I was able to put together a legal team of 3 different lawyers, one from a prominent firm in Seattle, and he was ex-Navy. One of our lawyers was ex-Marine, and the other one was ex-Coast Guard. So these 3 guys that had been in the service wanted to rub the Navy's nose in this thing a little bit because they thought it was ridiculous. So we were actually able to find the person who dumped the airplane in the lake and use him as an expert witness. And that was a key part of our case. And so eventually we showed that the Navy, by practice, had been dumping the stuff in the lake. They no longer wanted it. And in Article 5 of the Constitution, the government has the ability to abandon property. This was determined to be abandoned property.
So you and your friend take ownership of the plane, and what do you do with it then?
We actually went out and salvaged 4 more, 2 Curtis Hell divers and 2 F4Fs that were part of the same barge load that was dumped in the lake. We very quickly came up with a buyer for the airplane. And I remember when we came to pick it up that I asked him, now remind you, I'm in my 20s. And I said, how long is it going to take you to restore this airplane? He said, 20, 30 years. And I'm like, what? Are you crazy? I'm 20 years old. You're going to spend the whole extent of my life restoring this airplane? And it turned out he was pretty accurate. It's been 40 years now, and the airplane is just about ready to fly.
Wow. So, just about ready to fly. That's amazing. I understand that once the recovery of the SS Pacific is complete, the Northwest Shipwreck Alliance hopes to create a museum dedicated to the SS Pacific.
The Puget Sound area has a great maritime history to it. Strangely enough, there isn't a maritime museum dedicated to that legacy. So we want to use the Pacific and the artifacts that we find from that to help illuminate an important part of Northwest history, but also include other vessels and have a general purpose maritime museum. So we're looking around for the right area in Puget Sound to host this museum. We want to build a large complex with a hotel and convention center and all this sort of stuff. So we got some big plans. We'll see if we can make it all happen. But we have the right wreck to be the centerpiece of this project.
With the technology, Jeff, that you've helped to develop, more planes and ships that were thought to be lost to history might be found. Are you looking to future projects after the SS Pacific? And if so, what might they be?
We actually have made pretty good progress on one other major shipwreck in this area, which we'll be announcing later. But we do have a number of other projects in the Puget Sound that are noteworthy and very historic. I, of course, in my research have found other shipwrecks that may be interesting to go after that are outside of the area. And now that this one is finally moving forward in the right way, I would entertain going after some of these other ones. But we'll have to save that for a future story.
I'd like to thank Jeff Hummel for being with us on this edition of Today in BC. If you have suggestions or comments, send a voice message to podcast@blackpress.ca. You may be part of our podcast mailbag segment. You'll find Today in BC podcasts on iTunes, Spotify, Amazon, iHeart, and Google Podcasts.